Are tariffs toxic? Most people haven't really thought about tariffs until suddenly now they burst onto center stage with President Trump's imposition of tariffs on key trading partners like Canada, Mexico, and China. And talk of tariffs seems to be giving financial markets the jitters. But what exactly are tariffs and how do they work? Do they really drive prices up? Which nobody wants, especially right now with the price of eggs and everything else. Are tariffs a way to protect the US economy from hostile powers like the Communist Party of China? Or maybe they're a way to protect the supply chains on which US military supremacy depends? In short, are tariffs toxic or not? We're going to explore that question on this episode of Independent Outlook. Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from Independent Institute in Oakland, California. And for the conversation today, I'm joined by three of my colleagues who understand these issues a lot better than I do. First, I'm always happy to have with us Dr. Philip Magnus, holder of the David Thoreau Chair in Political Economy here at Independent. Welcome, Phil.
Happy to be here.
I'm also glad to welcome Dr. Ivan Elan, director of our Center on Peace and Liberty, and an expert on the foreign policy angle of tariffs. Welcome, Ivan.
Thanks, Graham.
And of course, there's also my longtime conversation partner, Dr. Williamson Evers, who knows a great deal about the history and morality of tariffs. Hey, Bill.
Good to see you, Graham.
Good to see all of you. Okay, so this is a little bit confusing territory for ordinary people. And for this conversation, I've got to count myself as kind of one of the ordinaries because I've studied a little bit of economics, but, not that much. And I'm not sure I fully understand all the implications of this debate. So I'll ask you some questions. And if you can make me understand, I bet you can help our friends understand who are joining in with us. So here's a really basic question, and maybe Phil will tackle this first. But so how do tariffs work, and do they really drive prices up, Phil?
Right. So a tariff is fundamentally a tax. And in fact, it's one of the oldest forms of taxation because it was easy to tack a fee onto a good as it crossed a border as a point of contact for merchants back in medieval times. So the notion here, as they originated, is an easy way to raise revenue at a time when the state didn't have much of an enforcement capacity.
And who literally pays the tariff amount?
Well, the physical payment was always made by the merchant as they crossed the border or they landed in the port.
The importer?
So technically, yes, that was the person that they go to the customs house. And you look at almost any port city in the U.S., there's an old customs house, and that's where you went and you paid your tariff payment when you landed your ship there. But what it does in practice is very different than the physical payment. And this is something that's true of all forms of taxation. We have a concept we refer to as tax incidence, and this tells who the economic burden of that particular tax falls upon. And tariffs are somewhat unique in this, in that they have two distinct components of their tax incidence. One is directly related to the revenue function, and that is who actually pays, who absorbs the payment of that tax that comes across at the border. And usually what happens there is the importer will try to pass that through onto other customers downstream.
Oh, because he's got to sell the stuff that he imports.
Exactly.
And he had to pay that much more to get it, so he has to charge that much more to sell it to his customers. Okay.
Well, and you think of that, the same thing would kind of play out if we had a domestic excise tax on something. We put excise tax on tobacco. It's not paid by the tobacco company. It's actually paid by the person that's buying the carton of cigarettes at the gas station. So it's passed through onto the consumer. And that's the revenue component of tariffs. But tariffs also have another incidence component to them, and this is the protection rent. Because if you raise taxes too high at the border, your goal is no longer to bring in money for the government. It's not to actually collect the tax. It's a tax that's intentionally put so high that you are trying to deter people from importing altogether. And this is the premise behind protection. And what that does is the tax isn't actually collected, but the consumption of that particular good is diverted from a foreign market, the importer, to a domestic competitor of the same market, usually at a higher price that they can now charge. And that means that the domestic producer of the same product can put their products out to consumers at a higher rate because they no longer have the pressure of competition from abroad. And they, too, pass that through onto consumers in terms of the price increase.
So, Phil, What you just said, I hope our listeners can see as an answer to a question that they might have. And that question might be, can I avoid these tariffs by not buying any imported goods? And I think you just explained, but maybe you want to reiterate why that, which might seem common sense to people, just isn't true.
Right, right. So buying American is not a strategy here because you're still absorbing the effect of the tariff in raising prices at the border to keep other goods out. That just allows domestic producers, producers of the American good, to charge you a higher price. So
And
yes,
they
you're going to get hit in the pocket either way.
and they may have had higher costs, which is probably why the imports were going on anyway.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So if there weren't this, they might have been trying to sell the thing for the higher cost, maybe, buy flags made in America or buy, we all see on television, buy emergency generators all made in America or whatever it is. And they're trying to get the person to buy both the good and the sense, oh,
The
I'm
symbol.
supporting America. I'm
Yeah.
buying some symbolism. It's like you buy the car with the pretty girl and you think, I'm buying the car, but I'm hanging out with pretty girls. So,
But it turns out you're not.
well, I mean, Coca-Cola has always sold not just Coca-Cola, but also sort of the culture of Coca-Cola.
Yeah, it's branding.
Yeah.
Branding.
So
Anyway,
back to the
back to Graham's
transaction.
questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, so if there are Chinese made widgets and there are U.S. made widgets, and so U.S. raises tariffs on Chinese imported widgets. That means that the U.S. manufacturers of widgets will be able to charge a higher price for their widgets, and so American purchasers of widgets will pay more. And so consumers will lose out in the US. The specialized American widget makers will make out like bandits. And the
Right.
Chinese will sell fewer widgets to the US. And so they'll be poorer because they'll get less revenue from selling to America.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So that summarizes it. You're assuming that there's no trade diversion to other countries that also make widgets. And this is why tariffs get really complicated. You put
Yeah.
a tariff on one country, trade could actually divert to another country. And then Trump's finding this out and he's saying, well, we need more tariffs on other countries to protect the industry at home. But there's also one more feature of this. When you actually artificially raise the price this way by keeping out competition, you start to incur something that economists refer to as deadweight losses. And this comes from the inefficiency of the tariff itself. It's basically what it comes down to is the gain to the domestic producers, because they're all happy they get to charge a higher price, is in total significantly less than the net loss to consumers. So consumers are paying very small bits and pieces. They may pay a couple cents on the dollar for a more expensive toaster, a more expensive appliance, whatever it happens to be. Uh, but that's a cost that's spread across 330 million people. Whereas you have maybe 10,000 people working in the one domestic protected industry, they're making out like bandits. But the total gain that they have from being able to charge higher prices, it's mathematically certain to be smaller than the total loss to those 330 million consumers that are now paying higher prices on everything.
So I want to add something. I mean, everything that's been said about widgets is completely true, but I want to mention that there are people involved. There are people making and selling and buying the widgets. So in a sense, the state or the interest that's trying to get a special gain, that's trying to get plunder out of all this, is interfering with the lives. So we can't really make everything ourselves. The example of toasters. I'm in no position to make a toaster, an automobile, to grow radishes, any of this stuff. I rely on economic transactions, whether they're with people living in the United States or people living in Malaya. And so, in a sense, our efforts to better our own lives, we're being forced to take inferior goods because at the money we have, at the budget we have, we can't buy as much goods and services as we could if we had the lowest possible price.
Yeah.
And so
Diminishes welfare for all of us.
they're plundering us. They're stealing from us. Um, so, William Graham Sumner called the industries that seek this parasites. It's not like a new industry or an infant industry. It's a parasite that's on the rest of us.
We also
And
should mention one other effect in the long term. When we say protecting our industries, we may protect them in the short term, but in the long term, they grow weaker because they don't
Dependence.
have the international competition that they
Right.
would have. So I think that's an important factor to bring out the short-term
That's right.
protection
Yeah.
versus
they're
the
not as tough.
long-term.
They're not as wily. They're not as agile. They're not as productive.
Right.
They're not giving
Yeah.
us good a product. There's another way to look at it because they're saying, oh, well, we're helping our weak industries. Yes, okay, they are weak because they're
Propping
not.
up the weakest, and
Yes, but
over
we're
time they
also
become the weakest.
yes, but also we're doing so at the expense of the politically even weaker consumer.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So these supposedly weak industries are not politically weak because I said they got the tariff. And we who are suffering from the tariff being imposed on us, we're the really weak sisters in this that are getting it in the ear, so to speak.
So with tariff walls going up higher, so American consumers will face higher prices. A few select favored industries may get special benefits by having a more favored and governmentally protected position, but there'll be fewer goods to choose from also overall. So these sound like the reasons why uh, prosperity is threatened in addition to inflation growing. Is that right?
I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, depending on how far the administration goes down the tariff route, and Trump is doing this in a very erratic and frankly, I'd say an outright incoherent way. He doesn't seem to understand why he wants tariffs, where and when, and yet just seems to be threatening them left and right, sometimes backing off of threats, other times following through on them. It just breeds economic chaos. It sends the stock market into a downward spiral every time he tweets about tariffs. It has disrupted supply chains and orders and planning for major industrial firms and shipping because, if you need your raw materials 6-8 months from now and you don't know whether there's going to be a tariff
Ooh.
on it, your entire production process is now
Yeah.
like in limbo based on whether Trump is in a bad mood when he wakes up at 3 a.m. and tweets at Canada.
This
So
reminds me of the fact that we all
but
experienced this kind of disruption just a few years ago during the pandemic lockdowns, when all the
Absolutely.
supply, and then there were lines because there wasn't enough stuff. And this could have a similar effect if the supply chains are disrupted like they were
yes.
during
Yes,
COVID.
Bastiat gives an example. He says, well, suppose there are two cities in China, Chen and Chen, and there's a canal between them to facilitate traffic and trade and so forth. And one of the rulers of one of the cities starts throwing blocks into the canal. And so workers that are quarrying the blocks and transporting the blocks and throwing the blocks in the canal are doing great. But the people at either end are not doing great. And so the COVID lockdowns are a kind of throwing of a block, and trade is like putting up a blockade around the country.
Yeah, self-inflicted.
Tariffs are, yeah.
And so it's amazing what these people will do and what they have explained to them time and again. They don't want to understand, and the special interests keep giving these same arguments. I must say, one of the more poignant moments is John Stuart Mill, philosopher and economist and so forth. And he wrote a famous book in the 1840s called Principles of Political Economy. And in it, he includes the horrible infant industries argument.
Right.
And he was kind of irritated at everybody that used this, as not that many, quote unquote, from an economist standpoint, genuine infant industries. But everybody said, "Oh, I'm an infant industry, protect me." But Richard Cobden on his deathbed said, this one paragraph in Principles of Political Economy was so bad, so harmful, that it outweighed all the good of anything else that John Stuart Mill did in his writing. This man, Mill wrote on liberty. Mill wrote many important things. He wrote things on democratic voting procedures and all sorts of interesting things. And yet here is some terrible intellectual sabotage that he did.
So as tariffs rise, consumers are going to face higher prices, fewer choices, and there'll be economic disruption and supply of goods disruption. All of that, I think I kind of understand, but I have to turn to Ivan at this point because couldn't someone say, Ivan, that, yeah, the point of all this rising tariffs, isn't really to promote prosperity because it won't, and it isn't really to fend off inflation because it'll make inflation worse, but it's because we want other countries to do the right thing. And if we use tariffs and threaten tariffs, then isn't it better? Let me just put it really in brute terms. Aren't tariffs better than nukes? And so should we be glad to use tariffs as a tool for foreign policy, Ivan?
Well, we make the same argument about putting economic sanctions on, but if you look at the historical record, when you start having a trade war, which is tariffs, or economic sanctions, which is another form of tariffs, you hiked the conflict with another nation up a notch. Well, then you can hike it up again with covert action. You can hike it up again with war, and you can hike it up again with nuclear war. So it can actually be seen, these economic warfare techniques, as making war more likely. So it's not necessarily an alternative to war, although people seem to think it is. The other thing we have, there's two types of tariffs that are going on here. The first is with Mexico, and they're justified by different sections of the law. One is for diplomacy, and they purposefully justified them and used the laws differently. The Mexican, Chinese, and Canadian, the Chinese Act was actually a tariff has been put on, but the Mexican and Canada were threatened. But they were threatened because for political, to get them to stop immigration and fentanyl, even though Canada doesn't have hardly any fentanyl coming in. It was just sort of an excuse. It's sort of punitive, but it's diplomacy, at least in theory, is to get them to do something in foreign policy. That's a diplomatic tariff. That hasn't been used much. The economic sanctions have been used, but tariffs haven't been used.
But did it work?
Much.
Did it work?
No, it doesn't usually work. I mean,
but in the case of Mexico and Canada, these were very nominal things. In fact, they were things that these countries had already offered earlier.
Yeah,
So
I think
it
a
was
lot
like-
of this. I think a lot of this is the government pretending to do something different
Pretending,
from the
yeah.
previous administration, and it's all
Here,
for
look
show.
at the
There's a lot of show
razzle-dazzle.
going
Look at
on in
the
Washington right now. And the other
politics of
tariff
spectacle.
is the other type of tariff is national security tariffs. We have to put the national security in quotes. That's under a different law, Section 232. And I won't bore you with the actual law, but what they do is, and these are the copper, aluminum, and steel tariffs that have been put on. And they say, well, we need to bring this manufacturing back to our shores because it's national security. And this is the most effective political. When you say national security, everybody goes, yo, you're absolutely
You
right.
do everything.
But the problem with a lot of this is, let's take aluminum, for example. The CEO of Alcoa, which is a big American and global aluminum producer, they were against these tariffs because they said, well, we make production decisions. One of the rationales, which we've only kind of touched on for the tariffs, is bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Trump
That's
talks about
a big argument.
and the MAGA movement is big on that. However, in this case, this is a good example. The chairman of Alcoa said, well, we're against this because, that this is going to be a short-term thing. We can't count on these tariffs being there for more than 4 years, right? But he goes, we make our investment decisions on our plants and stuff. We make those on a 20 to 40-year time horizon. So he goes, we're never going to make investment decisions, that is building plants in the U.S. based on tariffs. He goes, we just can't do it. So it's very questionable whether they're actually bringing manufacturing back. The other problem with it is we don't need to produce everything on our own soil just because it's used in weapons. Copper is an example. It's used in a lot of weapons. But all we need to do is have friendly countries that we can get it from. And
And
copper,
why keep out aluminum from Canada? It couldn't be a more friendly country.
Well, it
right?
used to be.
it's right,
It
that's
used to be a
border.
friendly
Mexico and
country.
Well,
Canada are natural places
we're
to get
working on
national
we're
security
working
items
on it.
because you don't even have to transport them over water.
We're
So
working
it's
on
it's
alienating.
counterproductive to national security so the foreign policy tariffs are kind of in contradiction to the national security of the United States. But this is, and I worked in this a little bit myself, and with these types of investment restrictions and trade restrictions, and the boot manufacturers used to say that boots should be tariffs should be put on boots, foreign boots, because after all, the Army, the Marines, etc., need boots during warfare. Which is a ridiculous example, but these are the types of arguments that are made in Washington when industries want protection.
Right. And the cloth for uniforms is next.
Right. That's another one. Mhm.
Well, but a much more sort of compelling argument that one hears is that so much of our technology runs on, microchips, and they are manufactured, well, in China or in Taiwan, which of course is easily subject to mainland Chinese takeover. Wouldn't it be better if our industries relied on American-made microchips instead of Chinese or Taiwanese-made microchips? So in case anything bad happens, we'd still have all the chips we need. And shouldn't we restrict uh, foreign chips either by laws or by tariffs so that we can secure our industries, Ivan, with all these chips that are foreign sourced?
Well, a lot of these uh, elements of these semiconductors are metals. They're rare earth metals. They're lithium for batteries, titanium for forgings for jet fighters, etc. And they used to have a critical minerals list, and now they still have it. Only they change the minerals from time to time. But a lot of these minerals can be found in certain friendly countries. Like one of the reasons that Trump is threatening to take Greenland and Canada is because they have some of these minerals. And China has a lot of them too, but there are other countries that have these minerals. And a lot of them are, and also you can stockpile them if you need them. If the Pentagon needs them, they can stockpile them.
Or
for the
sometimes they
industries
can
if they have to.
substitute. Sometimes they can substitute a less perfect mineral for a more perfect mineral. I wanted to notice one thing that's sort of different about what Trump's doing now as opposed to what he was doing in his first term. And that's related to the penchant for tariff making to breed corruption. So now, if you want to have a tariff on on the goods from foreign countries that you're making, you might want to be engaged in corrupt practices in terms of bribery or whatever you're doing to make sure this happens. On the other hand, and this is where there's an interesting contrast with what Trump did in his first term. Let's say he has a broad sweeping tariff and a zillion companies, or more accurately, hundreds of companies, maybe thousands of companies, approach the administration. We want a carve out. We want an exception for us. This happened during his first term to an amazing extent. And this time, as far as I can tell, they're not allowing that. I don't know. Somebody might tell me I'm wrong, but they're not allowing
Well,
carve-outs.
I
They
think
may be
the
waiting.
tariffs
The
provide
tariffs are
him.
not there, and maybe they're waiting for the political shenanigans later.
I think that tariffs also provide Trump with a surgical knife where he can reward his enemies and support his friends overseas. And so it's usually punitive in the negative sense, but he could put tariffs on. You have two countries competing for the U.S. market. He could put tariffs on one, and the other country's favored. So he could work at both positive and negative for a country. But I think it does provide opportunities for corruption, and it also provides him a way to use it as a foreign policy tool. In that um, you can differentiate. You can make them as wide as you want. You can put a 20% tariff on everything coming in if you're totally vindictive, or you can just select certain countries. And of course, we've seen him use this as
He's doing
leverage to
exactly
get
that.
other things.
Ivan, you are a student of presidential and congressional power. And so you can probably answer this. I've been trying to figure out why is it that a president, in this case, President Trump, can, on his own say so, raise and lower tariffs? Is it because of the national security implications that as commander in chief, he's allowed to raise and lower tariffs without congressional action? How can he do this without congressional action? That's what I don't understand.
Well, the Constitution, if you read the Constitution, its text literally, it differentiates. In the case of calling forth the militia, the Congress is empowered to provide for the calling of the militia. That means they can delegate it to the chief executive. But on tariffs, if you read the portion, the clause on tariffs, it says you can lay and collect tariffs directly. So the Congress should be doing this, but it has delegated much of its power in this area to the president
Oh,
over
I
time.
see.
It's
And that's
time for a non-delegation doctrine to rear
yes,
its
Yes.
head.
yes. That's a big issue, but they don't seem to police it very well. So
Right.
that's a big reason why the Mexican and Canadian threat was based on an emergency law where the president can declare national emergency. And we have all sorts of
Oh,
national emergencies, which don't really seem to
But
be
but
national emergencies since they've been going
but
on for a long time.
excuse
And
me,
then
what's
he
going
can
on?
also not only declare the national emergency, but then he can slap these tariffs on under the law. And that, as I mentioned, they're using a different law for the Mexican, Chinese, and Canadian ones than they are for these product-based
Right.
ones like aluminum, copper, and steel.
So it's
Anything,
narrow versus broad
yeah,
powers,
but
basically.
Yes.
anything that's an emergency should be an emergency. It should be a newly emerging crisis. Excuse me, fentanyl has been going on a few decades. Immigration has been going on a few decades. Aluminum has been imported from Canada forever, from
Well,
when we
also
discovered the uses of aluminum.
the founders specifically omitted national emergencies from the Constitution. The closest thing that it comes to is that the Congress can suspend in times of
Habeas corpus. Yeah.
insurgency or
Right.
a national law, everybody breaking the laws or whatever, or foreign invasion. They can suspend habeas corpus, but there's no provision for either the president or the Congress to
Very
declare
good point,
martial law
Ivan.
or a national emergency. But in the 1970s, after Watergate, they tried to rein in all these national emergencies because they didn't even know
How many
many
there
there
were?
How many there were? Right.
yeah. And so they passed this law, but the problem was it didn't stop it because they failed to define emergency. And the Congress does a lot of that, to avoid responsibility. They go, oh, well, we're passing this law. This is going to correct this. There's too many national emergencies and the executive has too much power. But of course, they did this for show, and there's still lots of national emergencies.
Phil, did you have a comment on this subject of the constitutional dimension here?
Well, I think it's interesting here because what it basically means is we are operating in flagrant violation of the text of the Constitution.
Yes.
I mean, there's no reading of the tariff clause in the Constitution that supports this being anything other than a tax power of the Congress. And to give it over to the executive branch now, they've gotten away with that because up until really about the first Trump term, most attempts by presidents to exercise this variable tariff power were extremely narrow. They would last 9 months or 18 months. It was not something that was even worth litigating. Whereas here you have Trump declaring sweeping emergency powers over entire industries or entire countries. We need a constitutional test of this. And I'd urge like anyone that's affected by this as an importer would have standing to mount a
Yeah, they
constitutional
would.
challenge.
They would. And again, it reminds me once again of the lessons learned during the COVID shutdown periods, when, because of the alleged emergency, all sorts of powers were accumulated by federal agencies, parts of the executive branch that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to claim.
That's
I mean,
exactly it.
the CDC was dictating rent control laws.
Yeah.
It's the same basic constitutional problem of separation of powers being violated, I think.
Fundamentally so. And yes, we can say Congress needs to do its job and reassert its authority in this area. But even more than that, the underlying cession of power, the delegation of power to the executive branch, is just blatantly unconstitutional. And I'd ask every member of the Trump administration up to Trump and J.D. Vance themselves that are invoking this power, on what basis does it lie? Because it's not in the Constitution.
Mhm. There is an argument, sort of switching gears slightly here, that we have a wonderful history of using tariffs for prosperity and so forth. In the 19th century was a time of
Very
tariffs.
selective time slots chosen.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
yes.
then, of course, there's the Great Depression and supposedly the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which is one of the most sweeping tariff acts, which was done congressionally.
Yes,
One
yeah.
last point. Was allegedly for good, but turned out to be a huge driver of deepening the Depression. What is our actual history with tariffs, Phil? Do we have a glorious history of tariffs in the past?
We actually have a history of chaos of tariffs in the past, and it goes back to the very beginning. Now, the founding era, Alexander Hamilton does propose protective tariffs. The caveat to that is most of them actually failed in Congress. He didn't get what he wanted. It's really not until a couple of decades later when Henry Clay picks up that mantle and starts pushing for aggressive protectionism as a national policy.
The Morrill tariff.
Yeah, well, and you have a succession of these measures in the 19th century, and almost every single one of them is associated with a political crisis. The Tariff of Abominations in 1828 was so flagrant as a tax hike, it almost led to the breakup of the Union. You had South Carolina tried to nullify the federal tariff law, and it was
Wow.
really
Andrew
a
Jackson
negotiated retract
threatened to send troops to
to send
South
troops
Carolina.
over tax enforcement.
Mm.
You fast forward to the Civil War. Congress passes a protective tariff on the eve of the Civil War, and what it actually ends up doing is it infuriates our biggest trading partner at the time, which
The
was Great
British.
Britain.
Yeah.
And Britain would have been like a naturally anti-slavery power. Was like
They were.
everything said the British should side with the North, and Cobden even writes a letter to Charles Sumner and says, "What are we to do here? You say you're anti-slavery, but you won't move against slavery, and yet you're giving us this tariff to alienate us."
So the Emancipation Proclamation actually helped with the British and helped with the British free traders in
Absolutely.
blocking recognition of the Confederacy.
It
There
solidifies them.
was a guy named Roebuck in the Parliament who was a so-called philosophic radical. That is, he was a disciple of Jeremy Bentham, and he was pro-Confederacy, believe it or not.
There's
But generally,
yeah.
generally, classical liberals were pro the Union and blocked recognition of the Confederacy, although some ships were built in Britain. So this is an interesting thing because the South, of course, had a history of free trade. The Jeffersonian tradition tended toward free trade, and the Confederacy was a free trader. They had to be because they didn't have enough industry. But so our kind of intellectual descendants are the Northerner abolitionist free traders. So President James Garfield is one of them. William Cullen Bryant, the poet and editor of the newspaper that still exists today, the New York Post. He was a famous Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts that Phil just mentioned, was a strong abolitionist, a strong free trader. I could go on and on. The most fun one is Edward Atkinson, not very well known, but a great opponent of the Spanish-American War and a free trader and an economist and a popularizer of economics. So there was this whole Emerson was part of this. A ton of
It's a
famous
vibrant
people
tradition,
were
yeah.
part of this sense that freedom for slaves, emancipation of the enslaved, is of a piece with not coercing people, interfering, as I said earlier, between their choice of exchanges they wanted to make in order to enhance their lives, in order to have an effective barter to get what they needed and give what they could to serve other people. So there is this understanding, and this was also true for the 48ers. So people from Europe, particularly Germany, who fled to the United States as refugees from the unsuccessful libertarian revolution of 1848 in Europe, tended to also see this connection between anti-slavery and free trade.
Historically, probably, as I said, the most famous protectionist tariff policy was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act passed in 1930. It was done in a way with similar misunderstanding to the situation now, it seems to me. The stock market had crashed. There was major, economic problems as a result of that Wall Street catastrophe. And so while the country was beginning to limp because of the stock market fall and so forth, Congress decided to shoot the country in the foot.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say, Graham, you're missing another slight aspect to this. The stock markets are markets in the future. They're
Right.
markets in expected stream of income into the future. So the people trading in the markets can anticipate a nationalistic policy that was certainly coming up increasingly in Europe, but they could see that it was coming in the United States. So the crash already had built into it anticipation,
Expectations, yeah.
expectations of rational expectations of the cutting off of trade, in my view.
And so the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act just made it worse.
It did. It definitely made it worse.
Absolutely. Well, it's a classic case of mistaken central planning. The idea here is, they actually accelerated the adoption of the Smoot-Hawley Act after the stock market crash because they perceived this is the stimulus package. This is what you do when the economy turns down. And that was an open invitation to every industrial lobbyist to descend on Capitol Hill with bags of money and trade that for favors to get a favorable tariff rate, i.e. penalize all of their foreign competitors and insulate the U.S. economy. And they're quoting Henry Clay. They're quoting this nationalistic protectionist ideology as their justification in Senate
Friedrich
speeches.
List,
Yeah, and then
Henry Carey.
they pass the measure, and what does it do? It sets off an international trade war where all other countries that are penalized by the U.S. tariff start to retaliate against us, and as a result, international trade itself completely collapses.
Phil, I wonder if you would say something about the following. The first is, I think I've seen Doug Irwin, the economics professor at Dartmouth, who's probably the most important historian of tariffs for American history. I think he's said that the times of spurts of economic growth in the United States, although we've had plenty of tariffs in our history, the times when we push ahead are the low tariff times. And the second thing I would like you to say something about is William McKinley. There's much William McKinley worship going on.
Yes,
So
there
those
is.
are my two queries to you.
Yep. Well, on the first point, Irwin is exactly right. If you look to the 19th century, when are the major technological innovations that become the famous titans of industry in the late 19th century? When are they taking place? It's actually in a brief period of free trade after the Tariff of Abominations is repealed. And before the Civil War, there's a period of about 2 decades when tariffs were actually on the decline. And that's
The
when you start seeing
1840s and 1850s.
the rise of the steam engine. You start seeing technological breakthroughs that really set the rest of the century into motion. And then after the Civil War, yes, we have high tariffs, but the areas of growth are not the import competing industries. They're not the protected industries. It's places like electrification, the development of electricity as a utility, which you can't really protect, certainly not at that time in history. That those are the forefronts of innovation that's really going on. And yes, and you have in the middle of this fellow by the name of William McKinley, who's a member of Congress, and in 1890 he drives through what was up until that point one of the highest tariff schedules in U.S. history, and he reaches so far into the corrupt special interests that were lobbying for this thing that there's an electoral backlash. So for the next two election cycles, and he's basically swept out of office. So it's why it's really ironic that Trump has made this guy into a hero. This guy almost killed off his political career. Now he comes back a decade later and runs for president and succeeds. But it's not a political story of winning by any measure. It's actually a backlash against corruption, which is another recurring theme of the tariff era. Is every time that they overreached, there were repercussions at the polls, or in Smoot-Hawley's case, repercussions at the polls augmented by repercussions economically.
It
And
seems like
when
Trump is taking the Republican Party back to its roots, because that was the tariff was one of their major issues. if
let's
not the
say
major issue.
anti-slavery was their major thing. I mean, it's
Well,
interesting.
the other
it's-
aspect of the Republican
it's a-
Party's origins.
Yes, tariff and the American system they did inherit from the Whigs. But it's interesting, in England, the pro-Confederacy people would push, oh, this is just a war about the Civil War
Right.
in the United States. It's just a war about tariffs, which
It's
you
Charles
can-
Dickens's line.
you can see some economic historians still claim this. We'll
Yeah,
name
I
no
wasn't
names because
saying
some
that.
of
I
them are
think the-
people we
the-
know.
there's
But
the-
the point is,
But I
the
think the
Cobdenites.
Republican Party has been for tariffs from its inception, basically.
No,
We
not
did get it
during the
from Henry Clay and the Whigs,
1950s,
who
not
got it
during
from
the
Alexander Hamilton.
1960s, not during the 1970s. It was not. In the 50s, in the 60s and 70s, the Democrats were more pro-tariff. Walter
of the
Meany
20th
time.
of the 20th century.
Of the 20th century. You go back to
Yeah.
the 19th century,
Right.
Republicans
Yes,
are very
they're
much
very tariff.
the protection
Well,
party.
Let me just toss a little different angle in here. First of all, I want to point out that on our website, independent.org, which I highly recommend you visit because it's chock full of intelligent material that can help you analyze this and other topics. But there you will also find a remarkable reading list. There it is. Bill's holding it up. Recommended readings on free trade versus protectionism, which our colleague here, Williamson Evers, has created. Very much worth consulting. It's an excellent resource. But then I want to turn back to Ivan for a moment. Ivan, you are quite a student of the U.S. presidency over time, and you've paid a lot of attention, obviously, to current things going on. Is there, do you think, Ivan, and the other two can answer too, but starting with Ivan, is there a method to Trump's madness? It looks confusing, chaotic. He seems to reverse himself on tariffs this way or tariffs that way, or no tariffs or more or less. But maybe, is there a method to his madness? Is there an overarching sort of logic to what Trump is doing here, Ivan Eland?
Well, I think the thing all the actions seem to be tried to accrue as much power as he can, executive power, and he's taking this unitary theory of the executive started in
Exactly.
Reagan, but George Bush had the same goal, I would say, to increase the power of the presidency. They have this idea that the president should be all powerful and also be the unifier of the entire executive branch, which just seems to be ahistorical, because at the beginning of the republic, George Washington certainly wasn't in control of the treasury, because the law was written different for that department than other departments. And at the beginning of the country's history, different cabinet departments negotiated their budgets independently of the White House with the congressional committee that was jurisdiction. So, and of course, we've always had uh, uh, separate institutions but shared powers as far as treaties, war, um, almost nominations. So I think this unitary theory, which is building this uh, extra constitutional uh,
I I
presidency, I think
I
it's hit
tend
its
to
pinnacle under Trump.
agree with Ivan, but I do pose the following. So let's say you're a special counsel in the Justice Department and your job was created by Congress and Trump fires you. You decline to be fired. You sue him. You go back to your job and you go ahead and start ordering your subordinates around to do various things. Now, this is very peculiar. The president is constitutionally supposed to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Here is a subordinate who has been fired by the president, but is continuing to act with the authority of the executive power branch and tell people what to do. It is very peculiar. There's something, without saying I accept John Woo's unitary theory of the presidency, there's something to the point that if you're going to be executing the laws, you have to be able to tell people what to do.
It's a tension in the constitutional
It's
system
a tension at a minimum.
that goes back much longer than Trump. It's
Right.
the Johnson administration, the Andrew
Yeah.
Johnson administration came to a head over this. Can the
Tenure
president
of
fire a
office
cabinet?
act, right.
So we've exceeded our discussion of tariffs, but the reason we got there is because I was asking Ivan, was there some logic holding all the tariff stuff together? And the logic, according to Ivan, is this: it's part of the consolidation of executive power.
The presidency.
Yeah, that's your answer to me, basically.
Yes, and I think
Ivan.
it goes back to what we were talking about before, that the Congress has just become supine and is on many areas, war power, trade and tariffs, treaties, you name budget, you name it. The executive has taken power from all those things, and I think as to what Bill was saying, I think the the special counsel has to do what the Congress tells him to. The Congress makes the laws, and the president is supposed to execute them. And I don't buy this separation of powers. I don't think we've ever had separation of powers in the country. It's just a saying, but we have separated institutions and shared powers right in the Constitution.
I
So,
hear you.
I
I
mean,
hear
So-
you.
I think the Congress was supposed to be the dominant branch in Article 1.
It is
And,
supposed
and,
to
Clearly.
the independent executive and independent judiciary were supposed to act as checks on the Congress, not the judiciary and the Congress act as
Being
a check against
subordinated to the
all-powerful
presidency.
You are
executive.
right, Ivan, and we all pray that we could get back to that, but it's going to be a struggle. So, Ivan,
Yes, I agree with you there.
It is certainly
So-
a struggle.
So, Ivan, I wanted to turn to your strongest suit, which is war and peace and diplomacy and the national security state and this sort of thing, because there's a time-honored view about tariffs and trade battles that they tend to spill over into war. And the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant was even of this view. Obviously, the Cobden and Bright school, the Quakers in the United States, the American Cobdenites, all those people I mentioned, like William Cullen Bryant and Emerson and so forth, they all believe this. So here's what Kant says. He says, the spirit of trade cannot coexist with war, and sooner or later, this spirit of trade dominates every people. For among all those powers that belong to a nation, financial power may be the most reliable for forcing nations to pursue the noble cause of peace, though not from moral motives. By that, Kant has extremely pure, duty-filled view of morals. And where the world war threatens today, it will try to head off, that is, the financial power will try to head off through mediation, just as if they were permanently leagued for this purpose. He favored a kind of League of Nations to help,
So he's saying that
institutionalizes.
more trade, less
Yes,
war.
yes, he's definitely saying that, and he was a free trader. Obviously, that was not a major field of his writings, but he definitely was a free trader.
I think it's sometimes we can overstate that,
Uh,
but you know, we have periods of free trade like before World War One, where they, that I forget it was who wrote. You guys probably know this more than I do. The guy who said, "Oh well, we're never going to have a war because we're
It was
trading." And then,
It was Norman Angell in The
yes,
Grand
that's it.
Illusion.
And but I sort of modified that. I think trade uh, creates a peace lobby in both countries
And
or
that's what I
many
think
countries,
Kant
but
is
I think
saying
things
here.
can override this, like
Yeah,
raw
Absolutely.
nationalism or
sure. There can be
some.
concentrated interests that would benefit from war.
Yes, and
Yes,
also World
absolutely.
War One, we got dragged into World War One because we traded with the British and not with the Germans. So uh, that's that's one of the big reasons, and we lend money to the Allies and not the Germans, and so
Right.
we eventually got dragged into it. So and of course that wasn't free trade; it was
It was
more
managed
managed
trade or
trade. But
managed finance,
yeah,
right?
I think you have to be careful when you say free trade or trade. But
So
uh,
back to tariffs right now. This is kind of like my last major question, I think, for today at least. So for ordinary people, among which I very much count myself, one thing that I sort of I understand when people say this is that they don't see why it's fair, for example, for European countries, and I've heard Canada does this too, to have high tariffs against American dairy products, but we don't have high tariffs against their dairy products. Why doesn't everybody like? Wouldn't it make sense to like tell them, okay, you got to match us down? I mean, for example,
Well,
what if we said,
what about Graham, Caribbean countries saying, well, you can send your sugar to us, but you're not allowing us to
Yeah.
send our
right,
sugar to
same
you.
thing.
There's a lot
It's
of
the same thing.
hypocrisy in the trade world,
Yeah, it's like
and
so
including non-tariff barriers to trade that the European Union puts in
yes.
through regulatory
Right.
mechanisms.
Your gizmo has to have 3 arms on it. This is an American
Yeah.
gizmo. It only has 2 arms on it.
So,
but
I
if you're
mean,
shooting yourself in the head, stop doing it. And
Yeah.
that's what tariffs are essentially, because people pay attention to and I think Trump does this to some extent. He thinks that the trade balance. He wants to go look at the country's trade balance, who's ahead and who's not. We're ahead. Our consumers are ahead by having unilateral free trade. I think. I mean, you go for this tit for tat thing, but you're thinking about it wrong. And I think it makes our industry free trade makes our industries stronger in the long
Mhm.
term. It makes our consumers pay lower prices. And if other countries want to shoot themselves in the head by putting tariffs on, that's what they're doing. So what can we do about it?
So Bastiat has a story, and after this, I think Phil has got to try and explain balance of trade. But here's Bastiat's story about it. So a guy makes something in France, and he goes to New Orleans with it, on a ship and stuff, and he sells it, and he makes a profit, and he uses the profit, the money and the profit, to buy stuff, and he brings it back to France. Now, because he made a profit, that's an unfavorable balance of trade, okay? Because he came back with more stuff than he left. So the next time he tries to do the same thing, there's a storm outside the port and a ship sinks, okay? So that's recorded as a favorable balance of trade because he left with this large amount and he didn't come back with anything. So the French government sees this as great. So the next time he tries to go out, they attack his ship and sink it. Okay, and that way they definitely can have a favorable balance of trade. So
It's
I think
sort of like the
Bastiat in this story
broken
is
window
showing
theory of
how
Oh, it
trade.
absolutely is.
it's a broken
Yeah.
window. So, of course, Bastiat, Hazlitt. These are all the same
Yeah.
people.
There's
And,
a- there's-
and I would add that Bastiat was a conscious follower of Cobden and Bright. But
so
anyway,
Phil,
Phil, explain the
yeah.
balance of trade to the masses here.
Yeah, so it's basically an accounting relic. And the way to think about this is Trump is looking at one side of the balance sheet, the accounting balance sheet, without realizing that something else is coming back in return. And yes, maybe we are importing more goods than we export, but other financial instruments are changing hands. By very definition, the
Services.
voluntary nature of trade means a full accounting comes to zero. The balance is zero. What goes in
Products.
is paid for by what goes out, and vice
Basquiat used
versa.
to put on his newspaper, products trade for products. It's kind of a dumbed down version of Say's law, but yeah.
Yeah, it's so it's a complete misreading of basic accounting. I mean, this is grade school stuff. And I'll add a point onto this because I think to try to explain the incoherence of what we're seeing from the administration right now. On Monday, Trump announces he wants tariffs for protection. On Tuesday, he announces he wants them for revenue. On Wednesday, they're a negotiating bluff. On Thursday, it repeats. All three of
Exactly.
these things are in tension with each other. You cannot have one with the other two intact. So
And
pick
the,
one
and the
of the
most
three
crazy one is that you're going to replace the income tax
with
with
a revenue
tariff.
system.
And
It's not going to be
you should
anywhere near.
elaborate because you and
Yeah.
David Henderson wrote a good piece about the danger you get the worst of both worlds with the income
Exactly.
tax.
You're
So
just
say
asking
some
for
more.
taxes. I mean, we did finance the government predominantly with tariffs in the 19th century, but it was a much smaller government. If Trump were saying we're going to reduce the size of the federal government to 19th century levels, I am all on board. I think we all dream of that day.
That's right.
But it's not going to happen in any practical sense right now, given what he has on the table. And instead, what you end up with is you'll have new taxes on in the form of tariffs with the existing IRS system, and you're taxed twice now. So it's the worst of both worlds. But you got Trump seems to be vacillating between all of these different contradictory goals. No single cohesive explanation out of it, other than one that I'll offer. I think I think there are people in the administration that were recruited because they told him they were pro-tariff, and at various points of the week, they have his ear. But they have pro-tariff positions for different and contradictory objectives, and as a result, Trump is hearing 3 or 4 major messages on tariffs, and he just blurts them all out at the same time, even if none of them would practically work with each other. And I'd actually liken it to the problem we saw in the Biden administration on monetary policy. You had cranks and fringe oddballs like Stephanie Kelton and Isabella Weber and the modern monetary theory people. The MMTers showed up and they were whispering in Biden's ear saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. There's not going to be any inflationary repercussion from the spending spree that you're going on." And Biden, who's checked out anyway, kind of nods, okay. That became the policy, the law of the land, because you had some really strange fringe crackpots advising him, and we saw the repercussions. Well, the same thing is repeating with Trump right now. You have Peter Navarro and Orrin Cass and Robert Lighthizer and like these really fringe outside of the mainstream economic theorists that think that tariffs have this mystical property that are going to deliver
Magic.
prosperity
They're
to
magic.
us. Exactly. And they're whispering in his ears, "Oh, well, I can show you this weird model that proves that we can reverse the trade imbalance," which it's not even clear that you'd want to do that.
Water will run uphill.
Exactly. And they're whispering in his ear. And Trump's, he's not a deep economic thinker, but he gets the talking points from them. And then you start getting these policy pronouncements that are in contradiction with each other because he's listened to some really oddball experts that probably have no business being anywhere near the economic advisory agencies of the executive branch.
If
I wanted
tariffs are
to-
successful in suppressing imports in favor of U.S. production, then that means that there'll be fewer imports coming in, which means that there'll be less tariff revenue.
Right.
So if tariffs are successful at keeping out imports, they'll be unsuccessful at generating
raising revenue.
by definition.
By definition. And you have an even deeper contradiction. So if your goal is to suppress imports, okay, yes, you can penalize imports abroad. You could declare 100% tariff on any good coming into the United States, and that would be a deep suppressant on imports coming in. But what happens there? two
No
effects.
revenue.
Well, there's no revenue, but there's two effects on trade. One is every other country in the world retaliates. So they say, if you're not going to take our imports, we will not take your exports.
Right.
So now, if your goal was to reverse the trade imbalance, now you have given an incentive to every other country on earth to penalize and directly target your exports and undermine you. And then the second effect is all those higher prices. Remember they pass through. It's not just the initial producer. They try to pass through the cost of the tariff onto somebody else. It hits consumers broadly, but there's also a narrow party that it hits in very acute ways, and that is the export industry, because the exporters cannot pass through. They have to trade on a world market. They have to take prices abroad as their
Given.
area.
That's a given.
Yeah, it's a
They
given.
they can't bargain their way out of
Yeah.
that price.
So,
They're price takers. That's it.
exactly. A tariff to reverse a trade imbalance is actually like shooting yourself in both feet simultaneously and pretending as if it's achieving this end that they don't even understand why they want it.
If I were to select one of the various messages from the Trump administration on tariffs, the only one that seems to me to maybe have some possible fruitfulness would be in February, he was talking about reciprocity. And if reciprocity meant let's all agree to drop our tariffs reciprocally, I could imagine trade reciprocity being one of a reasonable principle as a means to the end of reducing tariffs. That
So
might
that-
be a way that Trump could extricate himself
I
from.
know, we don't know that he wants to extricate himself. He says, I'm Mr. Tariff Man. B, it's very hard to see that heavily protected industries like the sugar industry are going to put up with reciprocal tariffs because
Right.
Also, you have
they
free
would be
trade
put out of
agreements
business.
or a World Trade Organization or what to do that type of thing. You negotiate this down rather than threatening everybody.
Right.
We can
because
just
threatening
unilaterally cut it.
pollutes the whole atmosphere of it.
Right.
They can unilaterally cut every tariff. It's they don't need reciprocal. But
No, you don't.
It's
But
it's
There are other
possible.
ways if you want reciprocity rather than threatening people, you negotiate because
Right.
if you
That's
start a
right.
war, everyone's embittered by the war in addition to the
And-
bad economics with it. So
And we haven't said enough actually in this episode about how much trade war and trade retaliation there was during the first Trump administration. There
Yep.
was quite a lot.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. It's basically giving the other side an open excuse to retaliate against you. And we're seeing that right now, the Mexico and Canada situation.
Every
Um,
protectionist in those countries is leaping up and down and saying, "Oh
Well,
boy, this
exactly.
is
They're
great."
saying Trump has given the protectionists in both of those countries an excuse to double down on the very worst of their policies. And then you have the national government that their hands are tied. It's like they are being pressured by their public. Well, you have to respond to Trump. And it's back to what Ivan was saying. The easy political route in that situation is to throw up a retaliatory measure, to throw up a tariff or some sort of penalty, some punitive action. But it ends up actually hurting yourself and your own country if you're doing that. So Trump has set us off down a race to the bottom with every other trading partner he's alienated.
We promised our friends when we started this conversation to address the question, are tariffs toxic? And I'm afraid the answer is, yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. I mean, nothing is doomed. Nothing is fated. Things can change. Wiser heads can prevail. There is a way to avoid going down the toxic trail with unfettered tariffs. And it's not too late, but let's just hope that we can generate some conversation around this topic. I am grateful to all three of you for your expertise on the subject and for our friends who have been ready to join in the conversation. I invite them to visit our website, independent.org, where you can see Bill Evers' reading list on free trade versus protectionism, and keep us in mind as a resource.
I might add that several of the items on it were suggested by Phil and were very appropriate classics. So
To Bill Evers, thank you. To Phil Magnus, thank you. To Ivan Eland, thank you. And to our friends, see you next time. Bye-bye.